The Constitution started out with this idea that there is a sovereign. We're going to separate that power, which is supposed to be in we the people. We're going to separate that power up into three branches. We're going to limit it. We're going to enumerate powers to the federal government. Those are the powers only that they can have, and anything that we don't give to the federal government, they ain't got. Go to the Ninth and Tenth Amendments. We reserve it to ourselves or to the states. But the states, and I wonder how many people realize this who are listening. Did you ever remember the fact that the states are sovereigns too? We divided up sovereignty. Not only did we separate up sovereignty, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial, which, by the way, Article 1 is not Article 1 by accident. Article 1 in the Constitution is not the longest in the Constitution by accident. And Article 3 is not the shortest by accident. We separate up the powers of the federal government, not supposed to be a sovereign, a government with enumerated powers that we, the people, delegate to it. We separate up those powers, and then we say everything else is in the states, which it should be like 90-10.
Hi, ColemanNators. Thank you again for joining us. Today, I want to talk with a friend that I made through Jenna Ellis, who is not doing video podcasts anymore. So Michael and I had to go on and do one of our own. Michael Donnelly is a scholar and lawyer who I've had fantastic discussions with. And he sent me an article that I think will be give us some very useful perspective on the lawfare issue, because it deals with the attempt by international law fans, European International Court of Justice. I probably got one of the letters in there wrong. There's a little letter.
There's a lot of them, Ron. It's hard to get them right. It's too many of them.
What Michael's article describes, let me throw it up here. International Journal of Human Rights, a couple of years ago, Democracy and Sovereignty versus International Human Rights, Reconciling the Irreconcilable. Now, it's not as esoteric as you think, because what Michael wrestles with here is how judges in international courts have dealt with an issue. We often forget that the United States is a federal system. And in our Constitution, the Founding Fathers attempted and for a long time succeeded, with some very significant burps along the way, in balancing democracy versus, how do we put it? Rights. Democracy versus rights. And to some extent, as has been predicted for 500 years, the Europeans are trying to sort of do that themselves. But they come onto the scene in a much more freewheeling era, in a post-critical era, when words don't mean what they mean and contexts are important, and Mike will explain. But before we do that, I know that a lot of people, and when I say a lot of people, I'm grading this on a curve. A lot of people who follow me, so how many can that be? But those who do comment on things that on X and elsewhere, when there's any mention of international law, they reach for their rhetorical revolvers. And they say things like there's no such thing as international law, might makes right. And that's a little bit of an overstatement. Michael, what's international law? Actually, let me take a step back. Before that, I want to introduce you. Tell us about yourself. What's your background? How'd you get into this business? How do you make a living at it?
Oh, sure. Background. Well, served in the Army, fought in Desert Storm, Desert Shield way back in the day, went to law school, started a company, left the company to go into the nonprofit world, which is kind of where I got started doing this work. senior counsel at the Homeschool Legal Defense Association for almost 17 years, advocating for homeschooling. And the international component came in because I became the director for global outreach for Homeschool Legal Defense Association. So I've traveled to 30 countries, every continent except for Australia and Antarctica, well, advocating for parental rights, freedom in education. And I also took up teaching constitutional law at Patrick Henry College along the way because, I get bored easily. And, became a teacher of constitutional law. I've subsequently become an adjunct professor at Regent University, where I teach international human rights law and international criminal law to students. Along the way, I've also had a stint at the Yes Every Kid Foundation, a national education policy organization. And I currently have a job which is not in the realm of what we're talking about today, but I work for the Club for Growth, which is one of the leading political super PAC organizations advocating for conservative economic principles, and supporting, conservative, the election of the most conservative policymakers we can find. But I've kept my finger in the human rights jurisprudential world, as we've talked about, and commentating with Jenna and other people along the way about what's been happening, the lawfare against Donald Trump, the attempt to steal, or whatever you want to call it, elections, and this discussion between democracy and elites, the common people versus the elite, which is how I would like to frame this conversation we're going to have around this article I wrote, because that's what I had in mind when I wrote this article. This article is targeted at elites to help them understand that their vision of the future is wrong. That's ultimately what I was trying to do in this article, trying to speak the language of elites and explaining to them this concept of universality of rights totally opposes the idea of self-governance, which is what our republic is founded on.
And you cite hero to that effect in your article, that there is a widespread, our mentalities, especially the older we are, but our we see things, we see words and interpret them the way that we're used to them being used and interpreted. And we have, especially in this country, a tradition of judges at least being seen as these neutral arbiters. Yes, there are good judges and bad judges, and there are some biased judges, but they're at least out there trying to find the right answer in some objective way. And what we've learned from legal realism and from critical legal studies as well is that judges are people too. And judges have their own interests, just like regulators have their own interest. Judges are really kind of regulators. I mean, it's always amazing when statism fans, not amazing, it's completely unamazing, say, well, why would you want to cut the Department of Education? Don't you like, isn't education good? Yeah, I'm not talking about education. I'm talking about the Department of Education. Like the Department of Justice is also not really in the justice business. You did say something before we get into the meat of this, all that actually intrigued me, which was, I had known about your background with the homeschooling people. You got to actually deal with these issues in a micro way. Here you've gone macro with the international, but I've been discussing this with my wife, the esteemed writer at Legal Insurrection, and she kind of is on the education beat. And what's very frustrating, and you know this, I'm sure very well, is that the rights of parents to control their children's education are quite ambiguous. They're certainly not found anywhere in the text of the Constitution. They're the sort of rights that nobody would have dreamt on infringing on until our time. And it was just a case where the First Circuit, the issue where it's coming up now is the secret transitioning cases, where school guidance counselors, or frequently librarians for some reason, sidle up to young children. I'm not talking about 17, 18-year-olds, young children, help them understand that they really aren't happy being called a boy because really they're a girl or the other way around, begin the social transitioning process in the school. They change the name, they change you know, the pronouns, and they don't tell the parents. And a parent challenged this, and the First Circuit upheld the district court, which said that they had no leg to stand on. This is within the realm of what the public schools, which let's face it, the public schools are lost. That it's within the realm of what the public schools can choose to do, and really, here's my point: it's not. There is a very weak argument from free exercise, which is what inevitably lawyers end up trying to hang their hats on. It's not really a great free exercise case if you're sending a kid to public school. And they said, no, this is not a matter of free exercise. This is just basic civility. How do you go about being kind to another person? Call them what they want to be called. So in your article, you talk about how judges looking at international questions, or in the case of the lawfare that we're experiencing here, national questions, basically substitute their own judgments for not only you got another issue also. There's a tension in that process of the deference they give to democratically reached decisions. Think in the American context, same-sex marriage versus bureaucratic decisions. And I guess it's not only a dichotomy. There's another angle on this which comes up in the UK context, which is custom and common law. How has a country gone about doing its own thing? Again, going to the comparison with school, transitioning children. I've been doing all the talking here. Tell me, start this conversation out in the direction you think it ought to go.
You've started it very well, Ron.
My first question was, what is all this about international law? Is there really such a thing?
Well, the international law is an idea, and it's the law of nations. I don't even like the term international law, although I teach a course on international law, right? The law of nations and the idea of nations, that there is a law above nations in a sense. And when we talk about the law, we can't escape from what do we mean by that? Where does that come from? And right, it's a moral basis. And I would encourage folks to read Jenna Ellis's book of a moral basis for our Constitution. You've probably written some about that as well, Ron. Law is inherently a moral struggle that we have to rule ourselves. And are we going to rule ourselves? Is it going to be king? Is it going to be ourselves? Are we going to follow God's law? All of these questions are on the table when we talk about law. But international law is this concept of laws that nations recognize. And it used to be very limited. And here's the problem, and where we get into this idea of judges. The problem is that global elites who want to impose their will on us across the globe, okay, they're like, oh, we need global institutions. We need a global law to control the masses so that we can have things the way we want them to be. Basically.
Now, the conversation doesn't go quite that way. They're not, in other words,
no, they don't say that.
Right. What they say is, shouldn't the world be nicer? Shouldn't the world be prettier? Shouldn't we not have to read unpleasant things in the newspaper? And don't we?
Some people say that.
Yeah. You and I, the members of the elite, for purposes of this exam, we have power, we have influence, and our role here is, and we have these incredible educational credentials. So we know so much. So let us.
We graduated from Yale Law School like Judge Boasberg.
Right. Let us make man in
our image. You got it. Yeah. No, you've got it. Exactly. That's right. Exactly. And it's the idea of, the World Economic Forum, right? All these elites gathering together and they're saying, here's how things are going to go. Okay. And I'm not wearing a tin hat. They're saying these things out loud. So it's not like I'm some crazy person. Okay. I'm not saying anything that's crazy. I don't think so anyway. At any rate, and there's a tension between what the elites want to accomplish and how they want to accomplish it, and what we, the people, like the normal, average, run-of-the-mill people who just want to live our lives, raise our kids, and not have people tell us that they can socially transition our child without us knowing about it, to bring it back to your point. Okay. So there is a line that we draw between these things and the point that you made earlier. But when we get into this context of judges, what I want people to understand is this is this lawfare that was used against Donald Trump and what's happening right now with Judge Boasberg, with Judge Millett, with the 60 some odd preliminary injunctions that have been issued against the president in his first 60, 75 days. Okay. And you look back to the first term of Donald Trump, it was 50-ish across the whole administration, maybe 65 or something like that. If you put those two numbers together, the number of injunctions that were written against Donald Trump is like more than any of the rest of the presidents combined ever in the history of the United States. There's something going on here.
All right,
and
stop.
Go ahead.
Stop, because
Go ahead.
someone else said that to me yesterday, and I said, well, that in and of itself is one data point, but the response to that is, well, because Donald Trump is the most radical, non-norm respecting president ever, and the institutions that protect our law and the weak and the helpless naturally are going to do
Flash.
more to deal with his extremism.
I mean, okay, that's fine. Have that point of view if you want.
That we shouldn't take too much from from that one point, but except we drill down a little bit more and we find that's not really what's going on.
Well, so I guess let me just let me tie the two together, and that's a fair point, right? But the principle here is democracy versus rights, okay? And globally, what has happened over the last 75 to 100 years is this movement which scholars call constitutionalization, okay? And the second word is judicialization, okay? And I'm going to throw a third term at your listeners, which I think I want to claim this word. I'm not sure. I might not have invented this word, but I'm going to claim
Donnellization.
Juristocracy. I'm going to throw the word out there, juristocracy. Okay. Mark Levin may have used that word. I don't know. He wrote a book called Men in Black. And the concept that he wrote about in that book, Men in Black, is the concept of juristocracy, living under the rule of judges. Okay. And that's the point that I want to get at here is, and this is something we've debated for decades in our country, and it feels like we're moving a little bit away from it, but I'm not sure. Anyway, point being that this is a global movement, constitutionalization, using written constitutions, which is a relatively recent phenomenon in the history of the world. I think probably a good one, generally speaking. But
as an old Cold Warrior, I remember in the 70s and 80s hearing about how the new Soviet Constitution guaranteed everything. It guaranteed everything. And they would say, listen, American Constitution only have 20 amendments. We guarantee right to white bread. And of course, it was completely worthless. It was just words on paper. So,
as Antonin Scalia would say, a parchment guarantee.
Now, nonetheless, that it became a trend to jam. And by the way, I'm not telling you something you don't know. States are on the way to doing the same thing. Jam up state constitutions the way Europeans are, and make all kinds of things rights in order to keep them away from the demos.
Bingo. And that's this idea of judicialization. And there is a trade-off between rights and what are rights. We should have a conversation about what a right is, because we talk about constitutional rights, we talk about human rights, there's positive rights, negative rights. I teach a course on rights. And democratically elected policymakers who make laws. Like, that's the fundamental premise of our country, in my opinion, that Americans make law for Americans and that we, the people, elect people to make law for us. And they are the ones who make those laws, not judges.
But ironically, right, this is a paradigm that we established in 1789,
Correct.
which is,
Separation of powers. Yep.
let's go beyond the Magna Carta and say that notwithstanding the fact that there's a state that has a state and the state has sovereignty and that we understand the state's going to make laws legislatively or otherwise, they're going to be we're going to limit. See, I guess I just stumbled on the difference. At least theoretically, the Constitution is going to limit the power of the sovereign over us. But this yep, I got it right. What these people are doing is actually saying what the sovereign's going to do for us, and heaven help anything that gets in the way of the sovereign guaranteeing us, whether it's housing or free love or whatever the case may be.
I love that you, Ron. I mean, I couldn't have asked as a professor who does right,
Oh,
who
listen,
asks
that's why
questions.
the that's why the hair's all gone. It's all sparkly in there.
I couldn't have asked for a better opening to this a subject that I love to talk about that most people don't even talk about, which is this idea of sovereignty. Who is sovereign? Like we would say, God is sovereign, right? But when we talk about on the earth and in political context, what you said about limiting the sovereign from doing things to us in the United States of America, I would like to argue we the people are the sovereign. But is that really true? Because when you look at the attributes of sovereignty, are we sovereign or is something else sovereign? And this is like a pet theory of mine that I love to talk about when people will listen to me. That, the Constitution started out with this idea that there is a sovereign. We're going to separate that power, which is supposed to be in we the people. We're going to separate that power up into three branches. We're going to limit it. We're going to enumerate powers to the federal government. Those are the powers only that they can have, and anything that we don't give to the federal government, they ain't got. Go to the Ninth and 10th Amendments. We reserve it to ourselves or to the states. But the states, and I wonder how many people realize this who's listening, did you ever remember the fact that the states are sovereigns too? We divided up sovereignty. Not only did we separate up sovereignty, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial, which, by the way, Article 1 is not Article 1 by accident. Article 1 in the Constitution is not the longest in the Constitution by accident. And Article 3 is not the shortest by accident. We separate up the powers of the federal government, not supposed to be a sovereign, a government with enumerated powers that we, the people, delegate to it. We separate up those powers, and then we say everything else is in the states, which it should be like 90-10. Should be 90-10, in my opinion. Okay? Because in the states, we can actually exercise our sovereignty at the local state level and really rule ourselves according to what we in our states want to do, which is what democracy, in my opinion, should be about. And that is not what is happening today. And so you talk about sovereignty.
Commercial
stop
message.
right there.
Commercial message. He used the word, but actually, no, I got to do the opposite. Michael used the word democracy. It's okay to call our constitutional republic a democracy because it is a democratic republic. No one is ever talking about pure democracy. I wrote an article on this a few years ago where everybody votes on everything. That would obviously be rather impractical. You can't even get four people to order a Chinese dinner. Okay, certainly not Jewish people. We're talking about balancing democracy with other values, with rights in this case.
That's right.
The United States our government has critical, fundamental democratic components and values.
Well, which means self-governance, right? What we're talking about is self-governance. Like to me, that's what democracy is. And how do you do that in a large landmass while you're also at the same time separating powers of the government that needs to do certain things? I grew up in New England, and so we actually have democracy in New England.
Where?
In Grafton, New Hampshire.
I practically lived in Nashua.
Oh yeah,
Early in
not
my
too
career.
far.
We had the Nashua. Oh yeah.
Not too
Or
far from Grafton, about an hour and 15 minutes. That's southwest towards Boston. I lived in Boston for a while, but I grew up in a small town. I mean, you can have democracy there, town meeting. People get together once or twice a year. They vote on everything, and then you still have a town government, a selectman. Anyway, we're getting down the rabbit trail. Point being that sovereignty, this idea of sovereignty, who's really the sovereign? Because although that's the idea that states are sovereign, the federal government is sovereign, there's this dual federalism, this dual sovereignty. The federal government has sovereignty to a degree to interact with foreign nations. We have Article 6 in the Constitution where the government can negotiate treaties, which become the law of the land, which, oh, by the way, is really important in this whole conversation about rights and um, law and judges, because if a treaty becomes the law of the land and judges get to interpret that, uh-oh, problem, right? But back to sovereignty for a second. Who's really the sovereign in our country? Are we the people still the sovereign? I think, to me, I question that. Anyway, I'm glad you mentioned the idea of sovereignty.
yes, yes. Well, I mean, a long time ago, I should have actually found it while you were talking. I believe that judges have become the the de facto rulers of this country. I think it's reversible, but it's a fight that we have to have.
Well, and that's the point, right? So let's tie it all the way back to what we were talking about, this idea of judicialization and juristocracy, right? And this is a phenomenon happening all over the world where democratically elected bodies abrogate their duty. They give it up to the Article 3 branch, judges, and in some cases, even to the Article 2 branch. We've seen that in our country to our detriment. Our Congress, our elected officials who have accumulated so much power, it's too much power. They were never intended to have that much power. It's too much for our Congress to actually manage in a practical way. And so they did what any rational person would do, probably, which is delegate it out. It was never supposed to happen.
So
Never.
the end of Chevron deference is a step in the right direction there.
That's right.
But I always use this example, and Michael, really, we seem to be intellectual twins because we're thinking about the same things.
I take that as a compliment.
I always give the example of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Congress says you will not discriminate, and then along come the courts and say, well, I mean, you can discriminate the right way. You know that's just true. We're just trying to fix the problem. We understand what Congress meant. So at that, okay, bad on the judges, but at that moment, the Congress that passed the Civil Rights Act, or maybe the next Congress, was in a position to say, Supreme Court, you got it wrong. We'll we'll get it right for you. We're going to amend the Civil Rights Act to make it clear that we're also prohibiting what it used to be called reverse discrimination, which became, of course, affirmative action, which, of course, became DEI, and which has been so subversive to this country for the last 50 years. Congress sat there and let it happen. It is true, Congress has sometimes taken measures on trivial matters in response to judicial decisions, like the Religious Rights Protection Act. I think that was a waste of powder, frankly. But again, there's a million rabbit holes that we can go down. So here we are now. This is taking place internationally. It's taking place nationally, and I think also to some extent it's taking place on the state level. Is people expect the government to, and are comfortable with the government doing all sorts of things for them, even telling them when people start getting sick, whether you're allowed to go out of the house. And there was an example of legislative and judicial complete surrender of their role in the balance of powers. Executives were given these emergency powers, limitless, open-ended emergency powers, sometimes constitutional, sometimes in direct violation of the limitations of state constitutions. And even, I think it was Michigan, the judges said, yeah, well, but there's still an emergency. And I remember listening to some of the COVID challenge arguments in the Supreme Court, and Justice Sotomayor said, yeah, but this is an emergency. Yeah, but this is an emergency. And I kept waiting for one of the lawyers to say, that's what the Constitution is for. It's the emergencies when tyrants are going to claim that it's time to just as Lincoln ultimately was found to have violated the Constitution when he restricted the free press. Now what? Now what, Michael?
Well, right. And so we have this problem, which is it's interesting because, how did we get here? Right. Because you need to kind of understand how you got somewhere so you can potentially undo it. And one of the ways we got here was this is that we, the people, we allowed it, first of all. We put a lot of stock in this idea that judges are impartial, that judges are somehow not people. They're there to be calling balls and strikes, and that's what they actually do. And, in reality,
And we got bought off. All of
and
a
go
sudden,
ahead.
everyone became a recipient of something.
Uh,
Everyone had a program that he benefited from. So that there is a very, very small core of people who really want nothing from government and will even walk away from a benefit. But the vast majority of people can be bought. And that accustoms you politically to the idea that government is there to get you things. And now you're going to give up your sovereignty in return for stuff.
and by saying that, you put your finger on this concept of positive versus negative rights, because this idea of positive rights versus negative rights, which is important, right? Negative is the things that government should not or cannot do to you. Like we have free speech, for example. Government cannot infringe on our right to bear arms. These are negative rights. Positive rights are those things which should be extraordinarily limited, if ever. The idea that government has a duty to provide you with something, right? Go
I
ahead.
have heard, and you sometimes hear people, and I think I've even heard it in some audio of arguments. People slip into saying, well, the government has the right to. Whoa!
Governments have no rights.
Oh, and this has come up far too often. I'm waiting for the Supreme Court to please do something about this.
You'll be nice.
Government's free speech right. There's a doctrine which, if you narrow it enough, makes perfect sense. Obviously, the government has to have the ability, the power to express itself, so to speak, because otherwise it can't work. That's how civilization functions. But there's no First Amendment right. In the government doesn't have it's a negative right. Here's what the government can't say about what we say. It has nothing. The government doesn't have any freaking rights.
That very
Like
well
that.
said. Very well said. No, the government doesn't, and it bothers me sometimes when even today, like Carolina Levitt, she will say that president has the right, or Pam Bondi will say Donald Trump has every right, and I know what they mean,
It's a bad
but I
choice of
wish
words.
they wouldn't say it. And it's entered into. I mean, even regular folks, like whenever somebody says, "Oh, the government has a right to," I'm like, hold up. Governments don't have rights. Governments have authority. Governments have legal obligations. If they have rights, they're people, and they're not people. The king was a person. The king could have argued he has a right because he's a person, or she, whatever, queen, king, queen, whatever. We won't go down that path. But they don't have rights. People have rights. Government was formed. What is the hello Declaration of Independence? Governments are formed to what? Protect these rights. We all have the right to what? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Governments are created among men to protect these rights. We are all endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. We, the people, are endowed. Governments are instituted among men to protect these rights. That's what the charter of our country says. And shame on us as people, as the citizens of this country, if we forget that.
So now,
Because it's
though,
all right there. Yeah.
but this constitutionalization and the associated judicialization
Yep.
take that rights
Hmm.
mentality and turn it
Yep.
on its head and say
Exactly.
everything's going to be a right.
Hmm.
And therefore
Yes.
we'll decide what's right because that's what judges do, right? We're here to protect you against the government. But since everything's a right, I mean, Judge Boasberg, God bless him. Yes, I have two cases pending in front of him right now, but he doesn't, I don't think he listens to the culmination. Um,
Probably not.
he's saying, well, don't all these gang members have rights to individual hearings on their deportation? Never mind that I just granted them class action status. I don't know how those two things coexist, but no, actually they don't. There's no such right. There are topics that there are things that are desiderata even. You might think that they ought to have that right. You can address that to Congress, which has not granted them that right. In fact, it's given the president the power to deport them by concluding that they are an invading hostile force. What do you think anyone in the Supreme Court is listening? Maybe, again, not to the program.
Justice Thomas would agree with us. I think Justice Alito might nod his head on this idea of rights not being governmental, vested in the government. People have rights. Governments protect those rights. And you said it. I mean, the problem is if everything's a right and courts adjudicate rights, then the courts rule us. And that's the whole idea of constitutionalization and judicialization. And that's why you have a proliferation of this concept of human rights and human rights treaties, because this is an effort to judicialize the globe, okay, and use human rights as the control mechanism,
And to go back to
okay?
your earlier point,
Yeah.
judicialize is really critical here because we're going to ignore or seriously derogate the role of the non-judicial, the non-juridical components of the state, such as self-defense, national defense, protection against terrorism, enforcement of borders, deciding policy about immigration. And we're going to place it in the hands of people who know better. And that's your elites. And an excellent example of where this has happened and has been happening since go. In fact, it's really a model that I believe that the left in this country has studied assiduously is Israel. The judiciary is an absolute cornerstone of the founding elite of that country, secular left-wing Ashkenazi elites who and there's no written constitution in Israel. So constitutionalism without a constitution, I don't know if it's probably worse than constitutionalism with a constitution, especially when you have a bare bones constitution like ours, which is less subject to the kind of abuses that you describe in your article. Because when judges start interpreting text, then the more text they have to go on, the easier it is for them to cover themselves.
Mm-hmm.
What the Israeli Supreme Court has done, first of all, the Israeli Supreme Court has so detached itself from democracy. Its membership is decided by itself. It names its own successors. So
Whoa,
it's
I didn't know that.
utterly unanswerable to to the state, to the people who are supposed to comprise the sovereigns in the state. Because Israel is a democracy also, but the judiciary it's even worse than what we have here. Um, so, do you think there's anything short of philosophical enlightenment at the very top that we can do besides having discussions like this? Is there a bill? Is there a legislative single legislative endeavor that you think could get us on the right track on these
Yeah.
issues?
Actually, I do, and I would point to
It's
Mike
a good
Lee.
thing you
Mike
do
Lee.
because I was a big sir. I did ask. I stumbled a lot asking it, so I gave you a chance to think think of something.
Yeah, I appreciate that. No, I think there is. I mean, thankfully, we have a constitution. We have a Congress. I mean, as problematic as things have become, as the federal government has accrued so much power because of the amount of money that it takes and the amount of legislation, and it's taken away so much of the state's powers through the money that it has taken and the acquiescence also by the third Article 3 branch, the judiciary, which has enabled both Congress to get away with not doing its job, and at the same time allowing Article 2 to do way more than it's supposed to do over the last 100 years or so. Okay. But realizing the problem is step one. And what's happening now with President Trump, I think, is bringing to the popular mind the practical effect of this problem, which has been brewing for decades and decades, for generations, really. And I think Mike Lee and a couple of other people in Congress are talking about this. First of all, you've got articles of impeachment that are being filed against some of these judges, which some people, Justice Roberts himself came out and said, hey, I thought that the normal way we deal with judicial disagreements is through the appellate process, not impeachment. Traditionally, that hasn't been the way we've done it. That's true, but we haven't traditionally been in the mess we're in, number one. Number two, so we could discuss impeachment against judges. I frankly favor them because I think that there is a line you can draw between what these judges are doing and violating the judicial ethics that they've signed up for. And I think that's impeachable. But I think there's other things you could say. But Mike Lee in the Senate has an idea where come on, Judge Boasberg, Judge Millett, name one of them. They do not have the constitutional authority to enjoin the acts that are lawful, that the president can point to that he has lawful authority on, whether it's Alien Enemies Act or something else, enjoining the acts of the president who's elected by a stunningly clear majority of the American people. That is the most anti-democratic thing you can do. And it should only be done very carefully by a district court judge. And these district court judges, mostly Obama-appointed judges who clerked for Carter-appointed judges, are just willy-nilly throwing out these injunctions. And it is absolutely unacceptable. So Mike Lee has proposed, hey, if you plaintiffs want a national injunction, then you got to go to a 3-judge panel, which then has an immediate recourse to the Supreme Court. Now, I don't actually think, I suggested to Mike in a Twitter thread a few weeks ago when he was throwing this idea out there, I was like, hey, why don't we make them file en banc? Because I'd rather have the most possible number of judges looking at this, because you start to get a little bit democratic and then you start to, actually apply more rigorous analysis and ask questions, which some of these district court judges aren't even asking about whether they even have the authority to do this. So one, you've got impeachment going on in Congress. Two, you've got Mike Lee, who has proposed this legislation that would prevent judges from doing this. And by the way, Article 3 clearly gives Congress the authority to regulate all judicial systems in our country, including the Supreme Court, by the way. Article 3 only requires that there be one Supreme Court, which means Congress has the authority, and they have done this, to completely eradicate all circuits and completely reform them and provide whatever rules they want on those justices and judges. And they should do it.
There's a lot that could be done with jurisdictional changes. The DC Circuit and the DC District are a terrible experiment that is the antithesis of democracy. A district for a city, a circuit for a city, and a city controlled entirely by employees and ministers of the government that they seek to supposedly regulate, or pass judgment on. Terrible. It was a terrible idea in the first place. And it's demonstrated just how bad. Yeah, but Yes, there are things that could be done. I do think nomenclature, some of the things that we talked about are things that we should be relying on our scholar friends and our government friends if they return our calls and texts or follow us back.
Or listen to your podcast.
Well, most they all listen to the
They
podcast.
all listen. Okay, that's good.
Certainly when I have you on.
Oh, well, I'll post this on my X account. But
Well,
by the way,
Michael,
people can follow me at Donnelly Speaks if they want to get my opinion on things.
Donnelly speaks. It's just so remember
Yep.
that because when I try to find Mike on X, I always forget that, and I'm looking MD, and it's Donnelly speaks.
Donnelly
He's actually
Speaks.
Donnelly speaks, and he does. You see, the guy he knows the words. Great conversation, Michael. I'm glad that we've been trying to schedule this, you know,
Months.
well before Donald Trump was president. So I'm glad
That's true.
the context for it really works out better now than it would have 6 months ago.
Indeed.
Fantastic talking to you. Let us do more stuff together. I want to hear more about the Club for Growth and be appointed to its board. Um, let's talk more about all kinds of stuff and continue the good work. Donnelly speaks is the way to find out what Mike is thinking, what he's up to, and I've followed him for a long time, and you should too. Thanks again, Michael.
Thank you, Rod. Keep up the good work.